Good afternoon, and welcome to the first episode of the fall edition of the Michael Eure Show. Our special guest today is Dr. Joyce Russell, and I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about herself after I tell you a little bit about what I know about her. She's an awesome scholar, English professor. She taught women's literature at Fayetteville State, and she retired from Fayetteville State. She's teaching some classes at St. Aug, and she's worked at St. Aug before. I love Dr. Russell because she knows a lot about history, and particularly Anna J. Cooper, who is from Raleigh, North Carolina, and a graduate of St. Augustine's and went to the Sorbonne to study, and is credited with writing a book called A Voice from the South. But let me right now turn it over to Dr. Russell. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and how did you get interested in becoming an English professor? And a lot of people just want to know what made that career path your desire.
Well, thank you, Mr. Eure, for having me, and I want to thank Wake Tech as well. Mr. Eure and I do go back quite a long way. We have worked on various projects together, and just a while ago, we were entertaining the idea of embarking on yet another project together. But I have always loved to read. That is until I became an English major, and then I became tired of it. No, not really. There's always so much to learn from books. This summer, I read about 10 books. I guess there's not much more to do because I can't get to the theater, which is another of my passions. Can't get to the movie house, another of my passions. So I have just taken to, or really continuing, my reading. I got my bachelor's degree from Bennett College for Women in Greensboro. I majored in English and minored in French. Then I became an Eagle, got my MA from North Carolina Central University, where I did a master's thesis on existentialism in the works of Richard Wright. And then on to Emory University, where I majored in interdisciplinary studies, which combined English and philosophy. So I did my dissertation on W.E.B. Du Bois and this phenomenon of double consciousness, which seems to be so much of a plague right now for us African Americans. So that's a bit about me. And I want to say that I am so honored to be here today to talk about the Black women and the 19th Amendment. Now, I'm going to tell you something about Mr. Eure, and he will support this. Mr. Eure contacted me less than 24 hours ago to ask if I would appear on his program. But this is what friends do for friends. So I'm very happy, but I want to tell Michael, don't make a habit of this. Okay. Okay, but I'm so happy to be here. Now, normally when I make a presentation, I don't like to start with the takeaways. I like to give the takeaways at the end. But for reasons of time constraints, I'm going to tell you the takeaways now so that I will be sure to get them in. Number one, first takeaway. The 19th Amendment, which granted women the franchise, was ratified on August 18th, 1920. Which means that we just marked the centennial anniversary of that event. Takeaway two, there were indeed Black suffragists, though some of the white suffragists did not welcome the involvement of the Black suffragists. And takeaway three, I want you to remember a title that Mr. Eure just referenced, A Voice from the South by Anna J. Cooper. And that book was published in 1892. So now I want to go back to Seneca Falls for a moment. That should be a location that is in your mind. Okay, Seneca Falls, a hamlet in Seneca Falls County, New York. First settlers arrived there in 1790. Seneca Falls was incorporated in 1831, and I like this one because I'm a movie buff. Seneca Falls possibly the inspiration for Frank Capra's film It's a Wonderful Life, and Seneca Falls, the birthplace of the women's suffrage movement. Many scholars and laypersons possess knowledge of the long journey for women from Seneca Falls to the ballot box. Such individuals are very aware that the Women's Right Convention was held in Seneca Falls in 1848. That was the first women's rights convention. Similarly, many possess an awareness of the contributions and dedication of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and these were two of the primary organizers of the 1848 convention. I believe I mispronounced her name. I think most people say Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So their names are imprinted on our collective memory. Now, what is not known by many is that the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 did not welcome the participation of Black American women. Now, the only Black person at that convention was Frederick Douglass, the only Black person, man or woman. Now, he was, in fact, Douglass was one of the first of the 32 men who signed the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, the document which Douglass would later refer to as the document that ignited the grand movement for attaining the civil, social, religious, and political rights of women. Now, to some of you, it may be astonishing that no African American women were present at that convention, for certainly women of color were residing in the North at the time of the convention. Among them, Maria Stewart, who was a lecturer, an abolitionist, a women's rights advocate. Stewart was, in fact, the first African American to lecture about women's rights. In a lecture which she delivered in 1832 in Boston, she demanded equal rights for all women, but especially for Black women. Now, the question here that may arise is this: if there were articulate Black women in the North who were the intellectual equals of their Caucasian sisters, why then were they excluded from the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848? Well, we might speculate that in the mid 19th century, most of the politically involved white women were so busy with their abolitionist work that they were simply not inclined to look at Black women as ones who could contribute to the cause of women's suffrage. Most of the early suffragists, who themselves were abolitionists, employed the strategies of the abolitionists in their own struggle for enfranchisement. Now, there came a time when there was a desire to merge the abolitionist movement with the suffragist movement. Now, on the idea of merger, some women, some of those white women were opposed to that idea, some were for it, but that disagreement caused a fissure in the entire movement, causing some women to actually leave the organization and to make their own statement, but left the organization entirely, but continued to work under another umbrella. Now, the problem for Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others was that white women, they felt, were being subordinated to Black men. Now, at this point, we might need to say a bit about the 15th Amendment, because the 15th Amendment actually gave the vote to Black men. Now, that enraged some of the white suffragists. As we would say in my home state of Virginia, those white women had a conniption. They did not want that to occur. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as I said, was very opposed to that amendment, and she believed that Black women, I'm sorry, that white women should not be subordinated to Black men. And Susan B. Anthony was really not a lot better, although we sometimes like to think that she was a little bit better, but she was not. They were of the same ilk. They believed that it just wasn't the proper thing to do. And all of these ideas can be attributed to racism, I would think. Susan B. Anthony even declared once to Frederick Douglass that this is a quote. She said, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I ask for the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." So there was quite a bit of racism associated with that movement, as you can tell. All right. Now, I would like at this time to lift up the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. Anytime I have that opportunity, I do so gladly. You probably are familiar with Fannie Lou Hamer. If not, then you really should learn about her. Fannie Lou Hamer lived between the years 1917 and 1977. She was an activist who was beaten and permanently impaired, all because she wanted the right to vote. So I am dedicating these remarks to the memory of Fannie Lou Hamer and also to the memory of Congressman John Lewis. Now, returning to the 19th Amendment, when the 19th Amendment was passed, I want you to think about this for a moment. Ask yourselves, do you think that the Black women actually exercised the franchise? The answer is no. Although legally they had the right to vote, you have to remember that states enacted laws that would prohibit the voting right or prohibiting Blacks from casting ballots. Again, in my home state of Virginia, for example, and many other states, I talk about Virginia because it is my home state. I know that poll taxes were enacted. I'm not so sure I remember the literary tests that were common in so many of the other places, but I do know that poll taxes were enacted to restrict the voting. But in spite of those restrictions that were put in place in the Commonwealth of Virginia, there were two members of my family who always managed to vote in every election. Now, my cognition begins with, I guess, the age of 4. And for as long as I can remember, my paternal grandfather, William T. Russell, and my mother, Annie Alexander Russell, always voted in every election. So when I cast my ballot, I always do so in their honor. I call their names and say, "Grandpa, Ma, I'm casting this ballot in your honor." I'm very proud of that because, to my recollection, they were the only two African Americans who were voters in my small town of Palmer Springs, Virginia. Now, returning to our focus on Black suffragists, I do want to remind you again that there were Black suffragists, but they were not welcomed into that suffragist movement. There was so many vitriolic voices, and you already heard one, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but there were others. And I mentioned Susan B. Anthony. And to me, it is a bit strange that these individuals, these two women, whom we regard as leaders of um, women's enfranchisement, that they were, in fact, really so racist. And their views caused so many to succumb to the wishes, the desires of white supremacists. So, getting back to the 15th, I'm jumping all over the place, but I wanted to interject that about these two women. Um, but I wanted to say that, or add rather, with the passing of the 15th Amendment, which allowed Black men to vote, um, Elizabeth Cady Stanton even resorted to name calling. She called Black men who were to be voters, she called them, I hate to say this, but she called them Sambos and rapists This is the kind of language that ensued from these women whom we regard as great women in the suffragist movement. Not to give the impression that all of the suffragists were like that, because certainly they were not, but these were the leaders whom we have learned about through the years. And let us mention that Ida B. Wells, a Black suffragist, was very prominent in the movement. Ida B. Wells founded what was known as the Alpha Suffrage Club, and she founded that in 1913. In that same year, 1913, the suffragists from around the nation were planning a march in Washington, D.C., and they planned that march on the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. Now, all of these suffragists had gathered, and the Black suffragists arrived, planning to participate in the parade. When they arrived, they were told that they could march only if they got at the end of the line. So they had to position themselves, or were told to position themselves at the end of the parade route. Now, Ida B. Wells was representing the Illinois delegation, and she wanted to march with the white suffragists from the Illinois delegation. But she was told, no, you can't do that. So Ida B. Wells, being who Ida B. Wells was, she waited until the Illinois delegation came by, and she jumped right in with them and marched in the parade in spite of their protest. So that's Ida B. Wells for you, and she certainly is one of my sheroes. Um, Now, I want to mention also that one of the chief organizers of that parade was a woman by the name of Alice Paul, and she staunchly protested, saying that she would not march beside any Black woman. So you can see how the tone was, and how Black women were rejected and somehow betrayed with regard to the suffragist movement. Now, other Black suffragists included Frances Watkins Harper. You would know her from literary fame. She was a poet, in addition to being an activist, a novelist as well. You probably know the name Mary Church Terrell. Maybe you know Nanny Helen Burroughs. There were many. And we come to our beloved Anna J. Cooper, whose voice from the South was mentioned before. And we know that Anna J. Cooper actually fought to have women earn the right to vote, or be given the right to vote. Um, she among others organized a club called the Colored Women's League. It was organized in Washington, D.C., and the first members were Anna J. Cooper, Helen Cook, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Charlotte Forten, who later became Charlotte Forten Grimke. Now, Cooper is certainly a star of the Black women's club movement, which I've not said a lot about, but I do want to pause here to say that the Black women's club movement of the late 19th century was very, very instrumental in political uplift and racial uplift, social justice. They had the motto, lifting as we climb. And they were very interested in community uplift and uplifting the entire race. And they wanted equality for all. So I want to suggest too that we who live in the 21st century are still benefiting from the work of those women in the club movement of the late 19th century. I belong to a number of organizations, clubs. Le Gym is one of them. We are a service organization. We do a lot of community work. I'm also a member of the National Council of Negro Women, and I'm sure you're a member of many such organizations. In our churches, we have missionary circles, all for the betterment, the improvement of our people. not to forget our sororities. We must remember our sororities. And if my memory serves me correctly, I believe that the Deltas, Delta Sigma Theta, I believe that they participated in that march with the suffragists in 1913. So let me continue by mentioning again that Anna J. Cooper really is a star of the club movement, a star of Raleigh, North Carolina. I visited her resting place several times. She's buried just a few miles, maybe a couple of miles in the city cemetery from St. Augustine's University. She's a star of Raleigh because another reason, we remember her. There is a monument in her honor at the corner of Eatington Street and East Street. I was there, I'm happy to say, on the day that that monument was erected. And I'm also happy to say that I gave the address that um, kicked off that whole day of celebration for Anna J. Cooper, and was there when the street monument was erected. So she is a star of St. Augustine's University, where she received her early education. And of course, she is a star for all feminist and certainly womanist scholars. When we use the term womanist scholars, we more than likely are referring to, well, all the time, we're referring to Black women who embrace the boldness and embrace the work ethic and the family ideals and all the principles of being a Black woman. We embrace the idea of stick to itiveness. We embrace the idea of making ways out of no ways. So, Anna J. Cooper certainly is another of my sheroes. Um, I knew a gentleman many years ago, and Mr. Eure would probably know Dr. Boyer as well. Dr. Boyer knew Anna J. Cooper, and Dr. Boyer told me that he interviewed her. And by the way, listeners, she passed away at the age of 104, 105, something like that. And she was memorialized in the St. Augustine's Chapel. I have been searching a very long time to find a funeral program. Anna J. Cooper, can't find it anywhere. I've looked in the archives on the campus, can't find it anywhere. So if anybody has anything like that, let me know, please, if you have that program. In closing, I want to say that if you have your passport, I'm giving you a homework assignment. I want you to look at your passport. You'll see on the pages, you'll see quotations by 13 individuals in your passport. All 13 of these quotations, most of them rather, are by men. 12 are by men. One is by a woman. And that quotation is by Anna J. Cooper, a quotation that appears in her book, A Voice from the South. The quotation reads, "The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race or a sect, a party or class. It is the cause of humankind and every birthright of humanity." So I close with that, and I hope that you will do your homework assignment and see for yourself this quotation that Anna J. Cooper has in this that has been included here in the passport, the American passport, the U.S. passport. Thank you so much, and now I think I need to throw this back to Mr. Eure.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Russell. And we have some questions and comments at this point. We have about 6 minutes. So, Renisha Stewart, who you probably know is a graduate of St. Augustine's
Well,
Gateway, is
hello,
saying
Miss
hello
Stewart. It's
to you.
very nice to know that you are out there. I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much.
So, Josie George wants to know what year or years did your mother and
My
grandfather
grandfather was
start voting?
voting really before I was 4 years of age, but I do remember that he voted in, I believe it was, I remember the election of 19, think it must have been, I don't know, but it was a year that can't recall now, but it was the year that Goldwater campaigned. And up until that time, my grandfather had always voted the Republican ticket. But the year that Barry Goldwater ran, he changed his party affiliation for obvious reasons, if you know anything about Barry Goldwater and history. And he became a Democrat at that time. My grandfather embraced the Republican Party because he always said that the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln and Lincoln freed the slaves. Yeah, that did work for Grandpa up until times really did change and the Republican Party or the Democratic Party became the Dixiecrats and all those kinds of things. So he really was a man of good judgment, had a very good political mind. My mother, I remember that she voted, surely I remember that she voted in the Kennedy Nixon um, uh, election. I remember that. She always was a Democrat.
Okay. Now, Dr. Chris O'Riordan Adja, the head of our engineering department, says, thanks for sharing, Dr. Russell. I'm always surprised and very humbled to know that there is still a lot of Black history that I'm still getting exposed to. And I believe what you shared is
Well,
special.
thank you so much for that. There is just so much more that we could go into. I want to say that when Mr. Eure and I first met, we were actively involved in the Anna J. Cooper Society, which existed on St. Augustine's campus. And through the years, we let that go away, but we want to resurrect that society. And Anna J. Cooper is such a phenomenal figure. I learned just recently that in Washington, D.C., because she lived there for a number of years, in Washington, D.C., there is a circle in a very exclusive area called Le Droit Circle, I believe it is, or Le Droit Place. Um, and the circle is called Anna J. Cooper Circle. And homes there go for $1.5 million. So I'm just amazed at how many people around the world, around the country, know Anna J. Cooper and lift up her work.
Okay. Do you know anything about her studying in France?
Oh, Anna J. Cooper was such an edu had such a mind for educating herself and educating others. Yes, Anna J. Cooper did study at St. Augustine. She went to Oberlin University, but I think that well, all of those are big things. All of these are great accomplishments. But to go to the Sorbonne and write your dissertation in French and to get awarded a PhD at the age of 66, that's a piece of history worth knowing.
Mhm. And now Chris has another. He says, knowing the rich history and statistics, do you think Blacks, especially women today, understand the importance of voting? And do you think the numbers have gone up?
I certainly do think that Black women know the importance of voting. Again, I'm going to be anecdotal for a moment. There was a woman in my hometown. My hometown is very, very small. But this young woman, unfortunately, I won't say unfortunately, she was not able to read and write, but that does not mean that she was not aware. She registered to vote for the very first time when Obama ran. She said to my mother, because she knew my mother was an activist and all, she said, Miss Annie Pearl, I want you to help me. I'm going to register to vote. I'm going to vote this time. So, not to imply that Rosa was not a smart woman. She was very smart. She just was not a lettered woman, but she voted. And I think that we all know the importance of voting now. And certainly, we want to encourage all people to vote, and especially Black women, because we know what has gone before, the rough road that we have had to travel to get recognition and to get the franchise. So I certainly think that more and more people are voting.
Okay. Ronisha says such necessary information. Thank you.
Well, I thank you. And I always like to say that, okay, I teach, I write, I'm a researcher, but every teacher is a student and every student is a teacher. So I always learn from persons that I'm addressing. I learn from students. And the minute we stop learning, that's the minute we may as well pack it all in. But I am a lifelong learner.
David Pollard, he's from Winston-Salem State, a graduate of A&T and chemist. He wants to know, as I would like to say, and he's a Raleigh resident, Raleigh native. I would like to say for any event of this type, I listened and I learned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pollard. I certainly appreciate that.
And Christy Shields, our Director of Student Activities at Wake Tech, where can we hear more on this topic?
Well, there are a number of books coming out. One is, it may already be out. I can't remember the author's name, but I'm sure if you conduct a search with the word Vanguard, I think that's the first word in the title. Can't remember the author, but I think this book came out in 2013, Vanguard. And I also recommend, I don't have the book before me, but there is a great book that was published many years ago by, I believe the woman's last name is Hutchinson, and it is called Anna J. Cooper, a very handsome book and full of information. So there are sources out there, and it is surprising to me that there are journalists who, in their columns, are now writing about, well, Black women's suffrage, and I've come across a few recently that really highlight Anna J. Cooper. And some have remarked that her book, A Voice from the South, is really, and I agree, it's a germinal text that laid the groundwork for those of us who work in feminist studies and womanist studies. So there's quite a bit out there.
So there's a lot of people that want to know how can they get in touch with you if they want to follow up. And perhaps some professors may want you to come talk to their classes. Who knows? But do you have contact information that you can share?
Well, I must say that I am old school. I don't do any twittering. I don't I don't do any Snapchatting. I do have a Twitter page, but I'm there only to read what others have written. But the best contact information for me is J.A. Russell at staug.edu. J.A.
Okay.
Russell at st-aug.edu. And I shall respond promptly.
Well, thank you. And thank you for coming. And your final thoughts in this current state. I mean, we're all in this pandemic mode, but we're also trying to get ready to vote. What do you think uh, about com- the vice presidential on the Democratic side, Kamala? And what do you think about the urban, suburban white women and men and this seemingly new coalition that has brought itself about?
Well, I'd like to start by saying that I do not honor the term alt right. I've heard that expression used some of the time, and I prefer not to even use that expression because often it is used in connection with the Republican Party. And I have to say that the Republican Party that exists today is not the Republican Party that my grandfather grew up with, or the Republican Party that I knew in the past. So I would say that it is important to study the candidates. It's important to listen to the news, regardless of what others are saying. But you have to really use your intellect. You have to use your third ear, your third eye, and you have to be a voter. You have to be a participant. And I would say too that we all can stand a review in civics. I heard recently, although I have retired from really watching the news, I can't help but see these news bites when I turn on my devices. I see these news bites. I heard today that um, President Trump was in the area, sort of encouraging people to break the law by voting twice. He said to send in your mail in ballot and then go to the polls to vote. Now, we cannot condone anything like that because that is really breaking the law. So I want us all to know that this really is a very important election. I want us all to know that we should vote early if possible, but safely. And I want you to know that America is at a crossroad. And although with regard to the pandemic, we are in COVID 19. But I've heard others say that we also have the pandemic of COVID 16-19, which means that we are experiencing still the racism, the fallout, the oppression, the mistreatment that arose when Black people were first brought to this country. So we have two pandemics, the pandemic of COVID 19, the pandemic of 16-19.
All right, and thank you again, and audience. Diane Rigsby, Ray, professor from St. Aug. Your discussion was very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rigsby. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to have to go, even though we've enjoyed you so much. And if anybody has friends that you want to share this with, it will be on YouTube this evening on the Wake Tech Eagle Stream channel. And you can just type in Michael Eure. And the show is the first and third Thursday of the month. And it's from 12 to 12:30. We went a little bit over, but that's just because people were interested. So we'll see you next time. And Dr. Russell, thank you again. And we hope that we can bring you back again.
Thank you, Mr. Eure. I really enjoyed it. And we'll talk again soon. Bye.
Bye.